The prairie sun hung low, casting long golden shadows over the clapboard chapel at the edge of Dust Creek. Heat shimmered off the wooden roof as the townsfolk fanned themselves on creaky pews, their Sunday best sticking to sunburnt skin. Inside, the air buzzed, not just with flies but with anticipation. Lace, gun oil, perfume, and sweat mingled in the air, creating an odd sort of fragrance only the West could offer. Lila Mae Dalton stood at the altar, her back straight as a fence post, jaw clenched so tight it ached. The dress, white as bone, clung to her narrow frame. She hated white. It reminded her of winter burials and surrender flags, but tradition demanded it. Her hands trembled, not from nerves but from the weight of every eye watching. She scanned the room for him again. Still nothing. Just a pulpit, the preacher shifting awkwardly, and an empty aisle that stretched like a dare. She should have known. From the back someone coughed. The sound cracked through the silence like a pistol shot. A murmur started. A ripple of confusion. The preacher cleared his throat for the 5th time. Lila didn't move. Her veil fluttered with a sudden draft from the open door. Outside, a dust devil danced past, mocking. Then came the sheriff, sweat glistening on his brow, hat wrung between his hands. "Folks," he began, voice gravelly and low, "I got something here." He unfolded a note like it might bite him. From Clayton Reese. Her stomach dropped. She barely heard the words as he read. "I can't do this. I'm sorry, Lila. I ain't the man you think I am." The letter ended with his name, scrawled in haste. No explanation. No dignity. Just ink and betrayal. Gasp. A woman somewhere muttered a prayer. Lila stood still as stone, hands still clutching the bouquet of dry prairie roses. Her father's ghost would have spat. A Dalton never ran. But now she'd been abandoned in front of half the county. Left like a broken saddle on a barbed wire fence. She felt her breath falter, chest rising fast, her vision tunneling. Not here. Not in front of them. Without a word, she turned and walked down the aisle, slow, measured steps, each one echoing like thunder in the silence. Her boots, hidden under the hem of the gown, clicked loud on the floorboards. She didn't meet anyone's gaze. Didn't need to. Their pity burned hotter than the sun. The doors swung shut behind her with a bang. She stood on the chapel steps, watching the dust swirl. Behind her, the congregation spilled out in hushed clusters, whispering like leaves in a windstorm. Somewhere, a kid laughed, unaware of what had cracked open. Then, through the quiet, a shadow approached. He moved like smoke, tall, broad-shouldered, a worn hat low over his brow, and a long brown duster trailing behind him like a whisper of some older time. Samuel Colt McCall. Folks just called him Colt. No one knew where he came from, only that he showed up 3 months ago with a Winchester on his back and a scar down his left cheek that looked like it had been earned in a knife fight or worse. He rarely spoke. Never smiled. But now he was walking straight toward her. He didn't say anything until he was close enough that the dust on his boots brushed against the lace of her gown. His voice, when it came, was deep and quiet, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. "Let's go home." No judgment. No pity. Just 4 words. Solid. Steady. Like the man himself. Lila blinked at him. For a moment she thought she might crumble. Scream. Faint. Anything to let this moment pass. But then something in her steadied too, like a nail finally driven straight into a fence post. She nodded. They didn't speak as they walked through town. Heads turned. Eyes followed. One man tipped his hat in apology. Another woman crossed herself. Lila ignored them all. Her boots thudded against the boards of the saloon's porch as they passed, the sound of piano music bleeding out behind them. Colt untied her horse, Clementine, from the rail without a word, adjusted her reins and handed them over. She mounted without ceremony, torn lace and all. Colt climbed onto his black gelding, Dust, and together, they rode away from the town that had just witnessed the death of her old life. The ranch stood quiet when they returned. The windmill creaked in the breeze. A cow lowed in the distance. The place looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she felt bigger, somehow, like grief had stretched her past the borders of the world she once knew. Inside, the house smelled like beeswax, wood smoke, and old dreams. She dropped the bouquet on the table. It hit with a dry thump. Colt stood in the doorway for a beat, then tipped his hat and turned to leave. "You don't have to," she said. He paused. She met his gaze. "You rode out with me. You might as well stay a minute." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. They sat in silence for a while. She unpinned her veil, hands shaking only a little now. He leaned his rifle against the wall, cracked his neck like it had been stiff for years. "You knew?" she asked, voice low. "About Reese?" She nodded. "I knew he wasn't the staying kind." He didn't look at her. Didn't figure he'd prove it like this. Neither did she. But maybe deep down she'd seen it too. Clayton always had eyes on the next thing. A bigger town, a louder room, a girl who fit softer into his life. Lila was all spurs and sharp edges. Her love was the kind that clung tight in a storm, not the kind that smiled sweet and stood still. Colt shifted, finally meeting her eyes. "You loved him." "I wanted to," she said. "Thought I needed to." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her fingers against her temple like she could hold the pain in place. He said nothing. Just waited. "I didn't cry," she whispered. "I stood there and I didn't cry." He looked at her, and something softened in his features. Not quite sympathy, but something more rooted. "Respect, maybe." "That's not weakness," he said. "That's grit." She exhaled, some of the weight slipping off her shoulders. "Why'd you follow me?" she asked. He looked toward the window. "Didn't seem right. Leaving you alone out here. Not after all that." "You always this noble?" He let out the ghost of a chuckle. "No, ma'am. I just know what it's like to be left behind." The words sat heavy between them. Evening light spilled across the floor, warming the wide plank boards and catching on the bottle of whiskey she kept tucked behind the stove. She poured 2 glasses and handed him one. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. "To lost things," she said. He lifted the glass. "To what comes after." They drank. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old barn door. Her dress, torn at the hem and dusted with the road, now looked like part of the landscape itself. She unbuttoned the sleeves and let it fall into her lap like a skin shed. "I think," she murmured, "I'd rather fix a fence right now than sit here remembering things that never happened." He stood. "Then let's find you some boots." She smiled. Not the delicate, practiced kind. A real one. Crooked and wry. She'd been left at the altar with a bouquet of brittle flowers and a name that tasted like ash in her mouth. But now, standing beside a quiet cowboy with a voice like stone and a gaze that never flinched, Lila Mae Dalton realized she hadn't been ruined. She'd been unburdened. As she laced up her boots and followed Colt into the fading light, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next would be written on her terms. And this time she'd ride straight into it, not away. The road back to the Dalton ranch was lined with sagebrush and silence. Lila didn't speak and Colt didn't force it. Dust rose behind them, golden in the fading light, casting long shadows of horse and rider across the dry earth. The breeze carried the faint scent of smoke and honeysuckle, an odd marriage of beauty and ruin. Colt rode a few paces behind her, not out of deference but caution, like a man who knew better than to crowd something wounded. The ranch came into view as the last rays of sun slipped below the hills. The house, squat and weathered, still wore the bullet holes from an old range war like badges of survival. The barn leaned slightly to one side, and the windmill creaked a rhythm only Lila seemed to understand. She dismounted without a word, handed her reins to Colt, and walked inside, the door slamming behind her like punctuation at the end of a bitter sentence. Colt unsaddled the horses, rubbed them down, and carried in her bouquet, now dry and brittle, the petals barely hanging on. He placed it on the porch without knocking. Inside, Lila stood in front of the mirror above the fireplace. The gown was still on, though one sleeve hung torn where a nail had snagged it. Her eyes, rimmed red, met her own reflection like a challenge. She peeled the dress off with slow, methodical motions, folding it over the arm of the chair as if handling something dead. She scrubbed her hands, her arms, her face, like shame might be rinsed away with soap and water. When she stepped out of the room, she wore old denim trousers, a plain linen shirt, and her work boots. The braid down her back was tight and fresh. The bride was gone. The rancher had returned. She found Colt stacking firewood by the porch. "You plan on staying long?" she asked. "Long as I'm needed," he said. "You'll know when you're not," she replied. He nodded, not offended. She had a sharp edge to her voice now, not brittle but tempered. Grief had stripped away the softness, and what was left gleamed like iron. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window with her father's old Winchester across her lap, watching the road. The moon hung heavy, low and yellow, and somewhere far off, a coyote cried. At dawn, she was already outside, mending a section of broken fence. Colt joined her without asking. They worked in silence, sweat and dust binding them to the earth. When the sun climbed high, he handed her a canteen. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said, "Why were you really here?" He looked at the horizon. "Had nowhere better." "That's not the same as belonging." He squinted at the nails in his hand. You ever think maybe you belong to the work more than the place? She didn't answer, but the silence between them deepened, softened. By noon she let herself smile. Brief, flickering like lightning in the distance. Colt didn't comment. He didn't need to. Some men filled the air with noise to feel useful. Colt filled it with steadiness. Later that week, the first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a bloodied horse galloping riderless through the property. Lila caught it at the edge of the creek. The saddle bore the brand of Clayton's family. The leather was stained dark and sticky. She brought the horse back to the ranch, her expression grim. Colt examined the saddle. This ain't fresh. Few days, maybe more. Lila stiffened. You think he's dead? Or worse, Colt said. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the air cooled, Clayton Reese limped onto the property. His clothes were torn, one eye swollen shut. A six-shooter hung limply in his hand. He looked less like a groom and more like a man fleeing judgment. Lila stood on the porch, arms crossed. Took you long enough. He swallowed hard. Didn't come for forgiveness. Good, she said. You wouldn't get it. He looked past her to Colt, who had stepped out of the barn. The two men stared at each other, history flickering between them. Clayton's hand twitched near his gun. Colt didn't flinch. They're coming, Clayton said, eyes now locked on Lila. The Redbone gang. I stole from them. Thought I could vanish. They found me in Cripple Hollow. Shot my horse out from under me. They won't stop. Why come here? Lila demanded. 'Cause I know they'll follow and you need to be ready. You brought danger to my land, to my people, because you were too damn selfish to stay gone? Clayton flinched at her tone. I didn't have another place to go. You had a choice. You made it. He looked at her then, and something in his expression cracked. Beneath the bruises, the desperation, there was shame. I thought I'd save myself, he said. But I just made more hell. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Clayton dropped his gaze and slumped down on the porch steps, breathing hard, every rib shuddering under the effort. Colt stood still, eyes narrowed. Redbone gang's no small trouble. You know them? Lila asked. I rode with them once, he said. Long time ago. She turned toward him. You never said. You never asked. She studied him now as if seeing him again for the first time. Colt, quiet and steady. Colt, with ghosts buried behind his silence. Why'd you leave them? They burned a homestead with kids inside, he said. For a sack of silver. I put a bullet in their lead man and disappeared. And now they're back? They never stopped. The pieces clicked together with sickening ease. Clayton, always drawn to power and greed. Colt, running from a past soaked in blood. And Lila, standing at the center of the crossfire. We need a plan, she said. They'll want revenge, not gold, Colt said. They'll come with fire and bullets. Clayton stirred. I can help. I can fight. You've helped enough, Lila snapped. But even as she spoke, she knew she'd need every hand, every bullet, every barricade. That night, Lila sat alone on the porch steps, staring out at the stars. The land around her felt still, deceptively peaceful. The wind whispered through the wheat, but she knew it wouldn't last. Trouble was on the horizon. Colt stepped beside her. He didn't sit, just stood there, arms folded. You're not who I thought you were, she said softly. I'm not who I was either. Should I be afraid of you? No. But you should be ready to fight with me. She looked up at him, the starlight catching the edge of his scar. Then let's make ready. He nodded once and disappeared into the barn, returning with a crate of ammunition and a battered shotgun. He laid it down beside her without a word. Lila touched the cool steel. She'd been raised with weapons, trained to shoot before she could sew, but this felt different. This felt personal. Inside, Clayton tossed in his sleep, muttering names like curses. Colt stood watch that night, rifle in hand. Lila sat by the window again, her heart no longer breaking, just hardening. The Redbone gang would come. That was certain. But so was this. Lila Mae Dalton was done being left behind. She was ready now. Ready to stand. Ready to fight. And this time she wouldn't be standing alone. The morning came cold and restless. Gray mist clung low to the fields like breath held too long, and the birds remained eerily silent. Lila stood in the barn doorway, arms folded tight across her chest, watching as Colt checked the traps they'd placed around the ranch's perimeter. The boards beneath her boots groaned faintly, echoing the unrest crawling beneath her skin. Clayton was awake now, seated at the kitchen table, a half-healed gash stretching purple and red across his cheek. He kept glancing out the windows, jumpy as a cornered rabbit. His presence in her home still rankled, but she hadn't told him to leave. Not yet. He was still a ghost with skin, pacing the borders of her forgiveness. "We need to reinforce the west fence," Colt said when he returned, voice low and clipped. "It's too easy to breach. Tracks out there. Not fresh, but recent enough to mean something." Lila nodded. "We'll double the barricade. Set traps along the brush line. I'll ride into town for more powder and nails." "No," Colt said. "Too risky now." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not asking permission." His eyes didn't flinch. "Didn't think you were." Their gaze locked, and for a second, the air between them buzzed with something unspoken. Not heat exactly. Wait. Respect forged in the fire of shared readiness. Clayton cleared his throat behind them. "I can ride in." Lila shot him a glare. "They'll be watching for you. You'd lead them right back here." "I'm not useless." "No," she said coldly. "You're just dangerous." He looked away, shame clinging to his shoulders like a second shirt. Lila saddled Clementine with brisk, precise movements and rode off alone without another word. The ride to Dust Creek was fast and tense. Every shifting shadow felt like it carried a gun, every gust of wind whispered her name. She stayed alert, but the town remained still. She bartered quickly at the general store, collected ammunition, food, and a few sticks of dynamite the old storekeeper reluctantly sold her. He asked no questions, though his eyes searched her face with silent worry. She didn't offer reassurance. Back at the ranch, Colt had already reinforced the porch with a second layer of planks and hidden rifles behind the water barrels. They worked together until sunset, stacking crates, stringing tripwires, filling bottles with oil for fire traps. Clayton offered help and Colt let him, but Lila barely acknowledged his presence. She couldn't afford trust, not now. That night, a fire crackled in the hearth. The walls of the house, once cozy, now felt like armor, thick, suffocating, necessary. Lila sat at the table cleaning her rifle. Colt whittled something from pine, the quiet rhythm of his knife against wood matching the tick of the clock on the mantel. "Why'd you never leave this place?" he asked after a long silence. She didn't look up. "Because it's mine. Even when it hurts you? It's still mine." He nodded. "Some pain's worth holding on to." She set the rifle down and leaned back. "What about you? What are you holding on to?" Colt's eyes flicked to the fire. "An old promise. One I broke." She waited, but he didn't say more. She didn't press. Colt spoke like a tree cracked by lightning, only when the storm demanded it. Later, as the fire dwindled, Clayton sat in the shadows, head bowed. "I never wanted to bring this on you," he said. "Then you shouldn't have come," Lila replied without turning. "I didn't know where else to go." "You didn't think about where I'd be when it all fell apart?" "I thought about it every day." She rose, slow and deliberate. Thinking about a person and choosing them are not the same thing. Clayton said nothing after that. That night the first attack came. A single gunshot cracked through the dark like the sky splitting open. Then silence. Then shouting. Colt was off the cot in an instant, boots slamming the floor. Lila was already at the window, rifle raised. Figures moved at the edge of the moonlight, 3, maybe 4. They slipped through the brush like wolves. "Fire trap line 3's been tripped," Colt said, loading his rifle. Lila's heart hammered. "They're testing us. Let's show 'em we bite back." Colt took the front porch. Lila moved to the back window, crouched and steady. The first outlaw stumbled into view, a scout, tall and lanky, pistol drawn. She didn't hesitate. One shot dropped him in the dirt. The others scattered. Gunfire lit up the night, short and fierce. Bullets slammed into the siding. Colt fired twice, methodical, no wasted movement. One of the attackers screamed. Then nothing. It lasted less than 10 minutes. When the dust settled, 2 men lay dead outside the barn, and the rest had vanished into the darkness. Colt's left arm bled where a bullet grazed him, but he barely blinked. "They were probing," he said, voice quiet. "Figuring out how deep we're dug." "They'll be back," Lila replied. "And stronger." She looked at him then, sweat glistening on her brow, eyes dark with certainty. "Then we dig deeper." They worked through the night. Colt's wound was cleaned and wrapped. Lila barely paused to breathe. Every trap reset. Every door reinforced. Her hands were raw by morning. At dawn, she stood in the pasture staring at the horizon. The light was soft, blue and pink, too gentle for what was coming. Colt approached, slower now with his arm bandaged. "You held your ground," he said. "So did you." He offered her a flask. She sipped and winced. "Rotgut," she muttered. "Best kind for mornings like this." They sat side by side on a wooden crate, eyes fixed on the fence line. "I was scared," she admitted after a long moment. Good. Means you had something to lose. She looked at him, startled. You're not afraid? I am, he said simply. I'm just too tired to show it. For a brief second they both laughed. Not loud. Just enough to remind themselves they were still alive. Inside, Clayton slept like a man hunted even in his dreams. Lila wasn't sure what she'd do with him yet. Forgiveness didn't come easy. But death wasn't the answer either, not for this. She returned to the kitchen and cut her braid. Not out of vanity but necessity. It kept falling in her face during the fight. She laid the thick coil of hair in the fireplace and watched it burn. The flames danced high for a moment, then died down. She felt lighter. Colt watched her from the doorway. He said nothing, just nodded once. That afternoon the wind picked up. Dust curled across the fields. Lila walked the property, checking every post, every trap, every weapon. She paused by the corral, stroking Clementine's muzzle. The mare snorted and nudged her gently. Soon, she whispered. Clayton approached quietly. He held a bucket of nails and a hammer. I want to earn my place here, he said. She stared at him a long moment. Then shut up and work. They reinforced the east wall together. He didn't complain. Didn't ask for kindness. She offered none. But she didn't stop him either. By evening, the ranch was quiet again. Almost too quiet. Lila stood on the porch, Colt beside her. The sky burned orange as the sun dipped low, turning the land into a sea of fire. You ever think about leaving this place? Colt asked. She considered. No. Even if I wanted to. It's in me now. I think I know what that means. You got a place like that? Used to, he said. Burned down. My fault. She didn't push. His eyes told her enough. Grief and guilt tangled like thorns. Colt, she said quietly, when this is over, if we survive it, what then? He looked at her and for once didn't look away. Then I stay. If you'll have me. She didn't smile. But she didn't say no. That night, under a sky of fractured stars, she slept with her rifle beside her, the scent of gunpowder still in her hair. She dreamed of wolves in the wheat, fire along the fence line, and a quiet man who stood with her when everything else fell away. The Redbone gang would return. She knew that like she knew the sound of her father's voice in memory. But now she wasn't waiting. Now she was ready to fight. And maybe, just maybe, ready to feel again. By the time the second attack came, the sun was just beginning to rise, bleeding red across the horizon. It was the kind of dawn that warned of blood before a single shot was fired. The stillness that settled over the ranch wasn't peace. It was the final inhale before the lungs forgot how to breathe. Colt stood by the barn, checking the last of the dynamite charges. His movements were slower now, deliberate, like a man counting every breath he had left. Across the yard, Lila moved like a storm gathering speed. Her eyes were sharp, her steps sure. The tiredness in her limbs no longer mattered. There was only one task left: survive. Clayton was already at the eastern fence, rifle slung over one shoulder, a pistol strapped to his hip. He had stopped speaking much, which suited Lila just fine. But he worked, harder than she expected, like a man trying to scrape clean the sins etched into his bones. Whether it would be enough she didn't know. But she didn't have the energy to hate him anymore. She needed every ounce of fire for what was coming. They heard the horses before they saw them. Hooves thundered over the earth like war drums. Dust bloomed on the far ridge. 10, maybe 12 riders silhouetted by the rising sun, their coats flaring like shadows. At the front rode a man in a blood-red duster, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow. But even from a distance Lila knew who he was. Eli Redbone. He'd once burned a church full of settlers over a land dispute and smiled as it turned to ash. He didn't ride for money. He rode for dominance. For control. And now he was here, gunning for revenge. Lila crouched behind the low barricade they'd built near the porch, rifle resting in the cradle of her arms. Colt stood just to her left, eyes never blinking. Clayton was at the shed, the signal position. 3 sharp whistles. The code. They were coming fast. The first explosion ripped through the outer trap line, sending up a geyser of dirt and blood. One of the outlaws flipped off his saddle mid-scream, his body landing hard in a tangle of limbs. The others surged forward, gunfire blazing. Lila didn't hesitate. Her first shot cracked through the din, catching a rider in the chest. He tumbled backward, lifeless. Colt picked off another from the barn's shadow. Then everything turned into a blur of smoke, fire, and sound. The Redbone gang fought like beasts, bullets chewing into the wooden barriers, windows shattering like glass teeth. The ranch groaned under the weight of war. Fire licked at the dry grass near the barn, and a plume of black smoke twisted into the sky like a scream. Clayton ran from the shed to the main house, sliding behind cover near Lila. "We've got 5 coming in from the rear." "Fall back to the kitchen side," Lila ordered. "We hold them there." He nodded and disappeared through the back entrance. Colt leaned toward her. "Dynamite." She didn't smile, but her eyes glinted. When they breached the corral, 2 more outlaws crashed through the fence, horses frothing at the mouth, pistols drawn. Colt dropped one clean through the forehead. Lila hit the second in the thigh, enough to cripple, not kill. She was sending a message. They wouldn't take this place. Not without a price that would bleed into legend. Suddenly, a flash of movement. Someone on foot, darting toward the house's side window. Lila swung her rifle too late. A crash of glass. Then a scream. "Clayton." She vaulted the barrier and ran, Colt covering her as she disappeared into the house. The hallway was filled with smoke. She moved through it like a ghost, ears ringing. She found Clayton pinned to the floor, struggling against a man twice his size, a knife at his throat. Without thinking, she drew her revolver and fired once. The outlaw dropped limp over Clayton, blood blooming from the hole in his back. Clayton gasped for breath, blinking at her. "I had him," he wheezed. She offered her hand. "No, you didn't." They made it back outside as another round of gunfire split the air. The front barricade was crumbling. Colt was bleeding now, a deep gash along his side, but he didn't fall. Didn't even stumble. He turned, raised his shotgun, and fired point-blank at an outlaw charging through the broken fence. The man crumpled, his gun skittering across the dirt. "They're flanking," Clayton yelled. Lila turned toward the corral, where 3 riders had split off and were heading toward the barn. She looked at Colt. He nodded. "Now." She grabbed the fuse rope from her belt and lit it with the ember from her pistol barrel. Then she ran hard and fast, toward the barn's rear where the dynamite was planted in the hay pile. The riders saw her too late. One veered off, another raised his rifle. She dove behind the trough. The explosion was blinding. Flame and wood and horseflesh flew into the air in a roaring burst. The riders vanished in a cloud of smoke and shrieking metal. Lila stayed down until the earth stopped trembling. When she stood, her ears rang and her arms shook. But she was alive. Back at the house, Colt was struggling to stand. She sprinted to him, catching his weight as he nearly collapsed. "Damn stubborn," she muttered. "Pot, meat kettle," he rasped. They leaned on each other, both bleeding, both breathing. Around them, silence began to stretch, uneasy and fragile. Only one rider remained. Eli Redbone himself. He walked now, calm as a preacher, his long red coat trailing in the ash. His revolver gleamed silver in the morning light. He looked around at the wreckage, his men scattered, dead or dying, his empire bleeding in the dirt. Then he saw Lila. He tipped his hat. "Miss Dalton," he drawled. "You've made a mess." "I'm good at cleaning," she said, raising her pistol. Colt tried to move forward, but she stopped him. "This one's mine." Eli smiled. "You got grit, girl. I'll give you that. But grit don't stop a bullet. Neither does arrogance." He moved fast. But she moved faster. 2 shots cracked through the air. Hers struck first. His gun dropped. His legs folded. Eli Redbone fell face first in the dust, the red of his coat mixing with the darker stain of his blood. Lila stood still, gun smoking in her hand. Then slowly she exhaled. It was over. The Redbone gang, what was left of it, fled into the hills before the sun reached its peak. They would not return. Not to this ranch. Not to her. The ranch was wounded but standing. Just like her. She sat beside Colt on the porch steps, both of them bandaged and burned, bruised and bloodied. But there was peace in the silence now. A hard-won quiet that settled deep in the bones. Clayton stood across the yard, hands on his knees, chest heaving. He caught her gaze and nodded once. She returned it. No words. No forgiveness. Just the small acknowledgement that he had not run this time. "Hell of a morning," Colt murmured. She smiled, weary and real. "You still want to stay?" "I came here empty," he said. "But now I think I found something worth carrying." She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "Home?" He nodded. "If you'll let it be." And in that moment, scarred, exhausted, and wrapped in the soot and silence of battle, Lila Mae Dalton knew that everything had changed. Not just the land. Not just the house. But her. What had been broken had not just healed, it had been reforged. She had been left at the altar. But now she had claimed something truer. A place. A purpose. A partner. The prairie wind stirred, whispering through the wheat. And somewhere beyond the hills, the dust finally began to settle. Ask ChatGPT.